This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, we ponder if D&D 5e is creating its own metaverse and do a deep dive into how to create complex, engaging social encounters. All that and more right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the number one D&D podcast in all dungeons and very popular with all dragons. And speaking of those two things, my name is Ben Byrne and I'm here with Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake, and James, I've got to ask you, dungeons or dragons?
Oh! Dragons, of course. Dragons, of course. Gigantic, fire-breathing, cat-like, lizard-like monsters, intelligent, with a personality, creative, devious. Simply, dungeons cannot compare.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair argument. That's a very fair argument. Shawn Merwin, dungeons or dragons?
I have to go with James here. As much as I would like to be, the dungeons are great, but yeah, when a dungeon lands on you, it doesn't do as much as when a dragon does.
Tell that to the Wicked Witch of the East.
That's fair. Yes. Yeah, that's true. She did have and it was a small dungeon too. It was just a house-sized dungeon. Dael Kingsmill, if you had to choose between dungeons or dragons?
It's dragons! This is going to be unanimous, surely. I was that kid. I'm sure plenty of listeners can relate. I got the Dragonology book and I memorized Dragon script. And my friend and I used to write our secret messages to each other in Dragon script all the time. Big fan of dragons.
Okay, all right, fair. I feel like it is unanimous. I would have to choose dragons as well. All adventures above ground from now on, but we have dragons at least.
Even if you wanted to pick dungeons, the peer pressure's too strong now.
Yeah, I guess that's true. Could I choose a dragon-shaped dungeon, or is that just splitting hairs? Or a dungeon that's inside a dragon, so the dragon's so big that you're like walking around inside its organs. Anyway, with that lovely image, speaking of which, bit of Ghostfire gaming news this week with the release. It is the start of the month of episode 5 of Fables, Citadel of the Unseen Sun, and we are getting to the meat of the adventure now as the party go from the wider realm of Soma or Astoya, and the adventure focuses on the city of Novostoya. James, what can you tell me about this adventure? What are you excited for with this episode?
This is a dark fantasy, urban exploration adventure that takes characters into the city of Gargoyles itself, the gothic metropolis of Novostoya. From its low, blood-drenched, impoverished city streets where gangs fight for control of what scraps their vampire overlords throw down to them, all the way up to the dizzying sanguine heights of the city's aristocratic upper crust. There will be vampire galas. There will be gang wars in the blood-drenched streets. There will be bloodhounds that will smell you from a mile off. There will be streets animate with foul magic that will themselves attempt to kill you. This is an incredible adventure that excellent author Anne Gregerson, who has worked with us on a number of projects, who has worked with Wizards of the Coast on a number of projects, who is known for her own projects on the DMs Guild. This is a truly outstanding episode of Fables. It's deeply tied to the story that we've been telling over the past 5 episodes. But truly, if you are just a fan of Grim Hollow, I suggest you get this one all on its own. It is an excellent little bite of what makes Grim Hollow such an excellent dark fantasy 5e setting.
Yeah, that's what excites me a lot about this episode and the last episode as well, episode 4, was the idea that, you know, if you've wanted to set a campaign inside Astoya and then focus it down on the city of Novostoya, or even if you want to do it the other way around, the campaign starts in Novostoya and the party head out into the wilderness. It might take a little bit of jiggering because the leveling is designed to be out in the countryside and then into the city. But there's, you know, it's packed full of lore, and just like, if you really have loved the concept of this realm from reading the campaign guide, it's a deep kind of delve into it, to be able to pick out the parts that you love, or run the adventure as it is. Dael, have you run a lot of urban adventures before? Do you enjoy the urban setting for your campaigns?
I feel like I've run a medium amount. I enjoy it, but I feel like I can get better at it. You know what I mean? I'm a big. That was my first sort of campaign that I started playing in with Pathfinder was Curse of the Crimson Throne, which is a big sort of urban crawl sort of campaign. So I have a lot of affection for it, and I've mentioned previously on this podcast that I'm trying to prep my own take on Waterdeep Dragon Heist. I'm very taken with the concept of urban settings for D&D games. So I hope I'm not bad at it. I've never heard someone say, "Wow, this was crap." But having said that, I always look at the stuff I like most and think that there's room for me to keep improving.
Shawn, what do you think of the fundamentals that when you're designing an urban campaign or an urban setting, what are the things that urban settings really need to make them feel urban?
Where's that bustle come from?
Exactly. What they provide is a lot of social possibilities. So when you design an urban adventure, urban setting, you want to make sure you make the most of those possibilities. If you're in a dungeon, and as we talked about, dragons are better than dungeons, but if you're in a dungeon, there's only so much social interaction that you're going to get. So when you do run a city adventure, and Waterdeep Dragon Heist is a grand example of that, where you have the ability to get your own building, get your own home base, and interact with your neighbors, and deal with city guards, and deal with all of the social trappings of your world, as much as the adventure areas that we would normally think of, out in the desert, out in the forest, in the dungeons. So make the best use of that as you can when you decide.
Yeah.
Also include at least one rooftop chase, not an urban game if there's not a rooftop chase.
I don't think I've done a single rooftop chase in any of my
problem.
urban games. So yeah, you're already ahead of me, Dael, in terms of planning urban adventures. I do find, there's an interesting flip there where if your setting is really urban, particularly, if you're trying to do a more grounded campaign, I know that I don't like to include a lot of monsters on the open streets of an urban city because, it kind of, that's more of a high fantasy thing, I feel. And so you want the monsters to be hidden inside of houses or in hidden dungeons or in sewers or, kind of around the edges like that. But if you're out in the wilderness, it feels a little bit odd if you have this full merchant kind of rock up or you have like this big social encounter. And so part of the fun I find when comparing urban campaigns to wilderness campaigns is finding ways to break up the campaign in terms of like when it's in the wilderness, how can I introduce a social encounter that feels organic to this environment? And when I'm in the urban environment, how can I introduce, a monster that doesn't feel like it's kind of out of its own environment, into this place? James, I'm curious how you feel episode 5 of Fables kind of balances between those two things. Obviously, a very specific vampire-filled urban setting.
Yeah, the second half of this Fable, episodes 4, 5, and 6, each one of those episodes feels like it focuses on a different pillar of the D&D experience, right? That's social interaction, exploration, and combat. And obviously, all three episodes have all three playstyles mixed in there, but it's in different proportion. Episode 4 was a big open world sort of quest-driven, exploration-driven segment. And Novostoya, once you're within that realm of social intricacy and faction management and the sort of high society etiquette of dealing with nobles who will suck your blood dry if you offend them, the stakes become different, the way you must interact with those trappings become different. And so even though there's a sewer dungeon in this episode, even though there is exploring the city streets, just like Shawn said, it's really the social element, the social danger element that becomes of most significant import here. And there are combat encounters that we think that people who like to get into fights in D&D will enjoy. Gang war battles, battles with a literal street construct, battles with the tracker bloodhounds, which are bloodier than the typical bloodhound, and all of that stuff. That's all there, if that's what you want to do. But I think if you're a DM trying to get at what is at the heart of this particular adventure, you will want to drill down into the social grandiosity of the Vampire Masquerade Ball, or the gritty sort of social drama of two gangs that hate each other because one supports the vampires and one doesn't, and all of the sort of messy interpersonal human stuff that happens when you're sort of a population oppressed by a blood-sucking upper class.
Can I say what I love so much about that description that you just gave is that like I said, rooftop chase is very important to an urban setting, right? One of the other things is gang warfare. I think that's a great thing to include in an urban adventure. And then plus, I think that the key thing for vampires, there has to be a masquerade ball. It's very important. And you just were like, ping, ping, done.
We're hitting all the big points
all
in
them
this
boxes.
one.
So as the stakes rise in this 5th chapter of Fables, the player characters should raise the stakes.
Oh.
One might say that, Ben. One might say that.
No, I look forward to diving in further because, as folks know, vampires are completely my jive. So I've been looking forward to this since basically Fables started being a thing. So check out Fables. Episode 5 is now released. You can check out the whole Fables adventure line. There should be a link in the show notes, or go to ghostfiregaming.com and take a look, because it is some fantastic work from the team that James has put together. Speaking of other news, there is a tidbit of news. I sort of found this, an article on Dicebreaker about some things that Chris Cox, the new CEO, or the newer CEO of Hasbro, was saying in relation to Dungeons and Dragons. And this news is... it's not hearsay per se, it is a little bit of speculation, but I want to break some news for once rather than reheat it after the fact. Not that I'm breaking this news, I'm reading it from another article. But I just thought that this was fascinating in terms of the direction that Wizards of the Coast are heading, especially after just acquiring D&D Beyond, and kind of comes off the back of a lot of the news that was announced last week. The long and short of it, I don't know if I buried that lead quite deep enough, but the long and short of the news is that Chris Cox, pardon me, was discussing the idea at a earnings conference call that D&D may dip into other franchises, may dip into other IP properties to create, like a campaign setting for other IPs, such as, for example, a Warhammer 40k 5th edition supplement. Now, the idea, nothing's been announced officially. The idea that a Warhammer 40k 5th edition supplement is something they might do is speculation, but it's based off this idea that in Magic the Gathering, Wizards have already been printing Walking Dead themed Magic cards and have a contract or an agreement with Games Workshop to do Warhammer 40k Magic the Gathering cards, and I believe Lord of the Rings themed Magic the Gathering cards. And during this earnings call, Chris Cox mentioned that it's something that they're interested in doing with D&D as well, with D&D Beyond possibly being at the center of how that might work. And I just thought this idea was fascinating for a bunch of reasons, thinking of D&D 5e almost as a platform rather than like a specific game with a specific world or specific environment or atmosphere that it's trying to evoke, but rather something that can be used to create virtually any sort of campaign setting that they wish to enter a licensing agreement with a third party with. So, you could get Warhammer 40k, Lord of the Rings, Arcane, or League of Legends was a campaign setting that the article just kind of threw out there as a possibility. Shawn, do you think that I'm remotely on the money here? Do you think this is something we could be seeing in the next couple of years?
Yes and no. I think, yes, we could definitely be seeing that in a few years, especially with D&D Beyond being a focal point for creating cheaper content that doesn't have to be printed. I think that expecting everything that happens in Magic to also be carried over to the D&D side of things is unlikely for several reasons. One, Magic makes a lot more money than D&D. So it would be it's more cost effective to make that license for something that is going to definitely make you a lot of money as opposed to maybe making you a lot of money. Other game companies already have the rights to some of these IPs to make role-playing games. You are not likely to see Warhammer or Lord of the Rings because there are already role-playing games that have that license. But that said, as the game continues to expand and gain in popularity, and that same earnings call where Chris Cox talked about this, he also mentioned things like Wild Beyond the Witchlight at its launch sold more copies than Curse of Strahd has over the years.
Wow, I didn't know
that's
that. Wow.
How fast. Yeah, that's how fast D&D is continuing to grow. They are still selling more beginner sets than they did originally. So unprecedented in D&D and in role-playing game history. After 9+ years, we are still seeing a growth in the original releases as opposed to a decline of sales. So, I think anything's on the table, and as more attention is paid to D&D, we will more likely see more partnerships with Hasbro, with Wizards of the Coast, and with these other IPs.
Oh, I want to note one IP crossover that has already happened, and a curious element of it. Stranger Things has already had a box set crossover with D&D that is set in the fiction of Stranger Things with their own Demogorgon, unrelated to the D&D Demogorgon. And the interesting thing to note there is that was not published by Wizards of the Coast. That was published by Hasbro's games division. And I wonder if that is a sign of things to come. Wizards of the Coast operates fairly independently, as independently as a studio owned by another studio can. But so far, the precedent that we have, if we ignore Magic, Secret Lairs, and other stuff with that sort of precedent from Wizards itself, if we just look at D&D and the 5e rules in this crossover space, that is a thing that has exited the hands of the D&D designers we know at Wizards of the Coast. I mean, they did work on it, but it was not published by their studio. It was published by their parent. So what that means for the quality of what could be published in that way, I daren't speculate, because the designers we trust are still on it. I'm always leery of what a mandate from a company like Hasbro could mean for the quality of a game product.
Yeah, sure. Well, I will wildly speculate just for a moment, just because what you've said makes me wonder. It's like, initially I heard this news and my original thought was, what if Wizards, did and I'm just going to keep using it as the example, but like a Warhammer 40k supplement came out from Wizards of the Coast, or maybe something a little bit closer to what they already do, like a League of Legends based on the Netflix series Arcane style campaign setting. But then, if you flip that back the other way, sort of semi-based on what you just said, James, what if instead they license out D&D 5e to the third parties instead to create an Arcane campaign setting, but that gets introduced in through D&D Beyond, so that it sort of has that tie back to Wizards that way, and the official toolkit could be used for it?
I was the lead designer on a product for D&D Beyond that was tied into that Runeterra setting for Bilgewater, Dark Tides of Bilgewater, and it was pulled after on its launch day because of conflict between fandom and Wizards of the Coast. Riot was very into the idea. Bringing up Arcane, Riot quite enjoyed the idea of doing 5e content. And they were quite hands-off in the process. But now Wizards owns D&D Beyond, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All the world has changed. All bets are off. Everything that happened in the past has no bearing on the future anymore.
Well, there's so many business, as James says, there's so many business connections and conflicts and twists and turns. But a company technically does not need Wizards' permission to create a 5e product, right? The open gaming license takes care of that. So any company that has any IP could make their own 5e game, and Wizards can't really do too much about it. Now, tying it to Wizards, obviously, and getting it on D&D Beyond, now that Wizards owns D&D Beyond, is a whole different story, because now you are tapping into a tool that is used by a very, very high percentage of D&D players, where if it's on D&D Beyond, it's official, where if it's not, it gets relegated sometimes into some other strange place. So getting that content onto D&D Beyond could be very important for game companies for sure.
Yeah,
Can
absolutely.
I also say, as the resident dabbler in Magic the Gathering, that these sort of quite hacky marketing crossovers are like my least favorite thing, right? Because I feel like, the Walking Dead fans don't care about the Walking Dead Magic the Gathering cards for the most part, and the Magic the Gathering fans don't really care about the Walking Dead Magic the Gathering cards for the most part.
In fact, they're mad about it, aren't they?
It's like the rubbish you get in the bag at a convention. You get handed a bag and it's full of a bunch of junk, and it's like, oh yeah, thanks for this starter deck of the Walking Dead cards that I can't even use in competition. It's like, I don't want it, and now I have it, and now I have to get rid of it. I don't want to kill the planet.
Sure. That's fair.
It's a spiral.
I mean, the other, maybe not a counterpoint to that specifically, though, but the other thing that this reminds me of, and this could be a complete false equivalency, but it's just what entered my head, is the term Metaverse, which I know is being thrown around on the corporate level, particularly in video game companies, especially with the success of a video
We're living in
game.
a sci-fi.
Yeah,
They're
right.
throwing around the term metaverse in the corporate level.
We're living in Ready Player One's dystopian future almost, right? Fortnite almost is that, because you've got Kratos from God of War or Wolverine from X-Men running around with Ariana Grande as a
And
playable
Naruto.
skin. Yeah, exactly. All within that same space. And so I'm just looking forward to the day where my D&D, or dreading the day perhaps, when my D&D party has a Tabaxi rogue and a Aarakocra fighter and a space marine and Bugs Bunny, this random assortment of things that get pulled in from other IPs, but the players are like, well, it's in D&D Beyond, it's right there. There's no reason I can't select it.
Speaking of crossovers, sorry, I just thought of a segue. I get to be Ben right now. Did anyone watch the Colbert Critical Role crossover for Red Nose Day, now that it's been released?
I watched the first. I'm waiting for a perfect night to watch the second. My parents want to watch the second. It's incredible.
Well, that's the thing that I found. My mum said, oh, it's been released, we should watch it. And that was our family entertainment for the night, was watching Colbert and Critical Role. And I will say that we were basically on the money. It's basically set up and presented in a way very similar to Critical Role, but with legacy editing.
So quick cuts, not doesn't show the whole game. It's not quite as. I mean, how long is it? Is it? I think I saw the clip was an hour and a half, 2 hours.
It's an hour and a half,
Sure.
and it doesn't seem to cut stuff out, but it's just the way that it's framed. So we're used to actual plays being here's all the players, they're stacked on top of each other, we've got their names of their characters up on the bottom the whole time. Critical Role always sort of rolls through the character stats on the side, whereas this really cut out all of that overlay. It would show you the character names and then they'd fade away, every now and then. But yeah, for the most part, they cut out any of that overlay stuff because that's just going to confuse an audience who aren't familiar with D&D, right? They're going to be like, what do these numbers mean?
Sure.
So none of that overlay stuff, and a lot of the framing was more here's a close-up of this individual person from, a slightly three-quarter angle.
Right.
Because it was definitely, I got the impression they were using Colbert's studio.
Sure.
Which had a lot more cameras and fancy camera angles. I don't know. It was really interesting to see something that was long form streaming content, definitely unmistakably, but framed as if it were for television.
That seems trippy.
It was kind of cool.
How do you feel it compares? Like, did it compare favorably in your mind to Critical Role, where it's just unedited all the way through?
Well, again, it was unedited. It was more like a live TV studio edit, if that makes sense. Like
Sure.
None of the content necessarily seemed to be cut out. It was just cuts between different kinds of cameras. I don't know. It's hard for me to say, oh, well, this one's better, right? Because they're made for different things. And that's half of what I mean when I say that this is a legacy edit. It's clearly designed for people who don't watch Critical Role, they watch Colbert. But I do think that they did it really cleverly. And I think that it highlights a lot of things that haven't yet been tapped by actual play creators that I think are going to be, and that I've sat there and thought about. I'm like, well, what if you didn't actually play, but you used, techniques from television? And
absolutely.
It's interesting to sort of see that sprinkled in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to see the difference between, to talk, shop for a moment, when we were initially looking for an editor for this podcast, for the Eldritch Lorecast. We came across a lot of individuals that had legacy media experience in like the advertising space or whatever it happened to be, but we really wanted somebody who understood what a stream or a podcast or a D&D specific content should look like. But there's a lot of you learn when you go and study media, you learn about camera angles and you learn about what lighting does and how color changes the mood of a scene and how to, set up your mise-en-scene correctly. And there's kind of like a reverse engineering study happening with the way that people are throwing up content online, where people will deliberately film things in their kitchen or their bedroom or something like that because it was incidental when people first started bringing cameras into their own homes.
But now it's part of the form, yeah.
Exactly. It's become part of the mise-en-scene to not look at the camera.
Skeumorphic. Ooh, here's a fun word for everyone. Skeumorphism. It's something that began as a necessity that is now no longer necessary, but is kept on as an aesthetic element. So the great example that I like to go to is when wood-paneled cars were all the rage. It began because they needed to use the metal for the war effort, and so cars just were made using more wood. But then after that, it was like, wooden paneled cars. And they could use metal, but they just kept using the wood paneling or things that looked like wood paneling because of this skeumorphism. It was like this aesthetic thing that began as a necessity. And I think that's similar to YouTube. It's like people started out filming in their crappy, one-room apartment that has a kitchen in the background, and they were on a crummy, phone camera or whatever. But now that is the look of it.
Yes. Yeah, there'll be media studies about this, in 10 years. Like the whole landscape of what people learn in school or university about media will probably change to reflect the way that streams, not just in D&D, but, video game streams and whatnot are constructed. You learn things on the Eldritch Lorecast, not just about D&D, but it's educational as well.
Don't say D&D never learned you nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that email from a couple of weeks ago, yes, D&D is educational, definitively. Speaking of educational and emails, we do have a couple emails this week, which we will quickly dive into, starting with Gethin's question about party composition. This was a fairly straightforward question about Gethin starting a campaign recently and finding that it was a very martial-focused party with, I believe, like a lot of fighters, a monk, a bard, a sorcerer, I think was in there off the top of my head.
I have the list right here, and I will say, Gethin, we will take this question seriously, but also I need to point out that a ranger, a fighter, a barbarian, a sorcerer, a bard, and an artificer is not a particularly martial party. You got 2 marshals, 2 half-casters, and 2 casters.
Well, it depends on how you build it, right? Like I guess. Like
it's a party with no clerics.
Yes, yeah, I think that's
what the real question is. Yeah.
Yes. Do you need a healer in your party? And to extrapolate the question out slightly, which I believe Gethin does themselves, is does party composition matter? James, yes or no?
Yes. A dungeon master or a game master or whatever referee of whatever RPG you play is just as much a game designer as they are a referee of the game they're playing, because they're making the dungeon, they're putting the monsters where they belong, they're adjusting the flow of the story, whether they realize it or not, whether they're taking, a primary role in it or just letting the players kind of run roughshod. They have a game design role in their game. And it means that, in my opinion, the best thing a dungeon master can do is acknowledge that and learn some game design, and lean into that role, rather than just sort of casting open their hands and letting fate decide whether or not their game is good or not. And even the best game designers can't bat 1,000. But what I would say in this situation is the DM does not have control over what type of characters their player base makes. This is a party without a cleric, and that does change the dynamic of the adventures that you go on. It will change the pace of the adventuring day. The party may need to take more short rests, which means that the game master might be better off using adventures that have less time pressure, because they'll need to take short rests and take an hour out of their day to heal more frequently. Or they could recommend the healer feat to their characters. And I don't want to hear any bad mouthing of the healer feat, because I'm playing in a campaign with the characters that's got one, and it rocks. We're in a clericless party. And the healer feat...
I feel preempted by being told not to complain.
You can complain. Don't listen to me.
Complaining is all I do.
The healer feat has saved my character's butt in particular more times than I can count. Just because I'm an artificer and I can cast Cure Wounds. I can, just like their ranger and their artificer can cast Cure Wounds, but I don't have that many spell slots. I'd much rather spend it on something immediately useful than Cure Wounds. Another option I would recommend, and this is where I'll shut up talking after this, but there is an option for healing surges 4E style in the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, where you can, in the midst of an adventure, kind of use some sort of power to instantly heal yourself hit points, whether that's literal physical wound healing or just a sort of morale toughening that is involved there. You could even work that into the fiction of your campaign. Maybe say your characters have been blessed by the gods and there is a divine spark that they can call upon to, at the cost of their own hit dice, whatever sort of vitality, stamina that represents in the fiction, use that instantly rather than in a short rest to repair their wounds and strengthen their morale, or whatever narrative justification you'd like to come up with for it.
I'm going to say the exact same thing James just said, but I'm going to answer no for exactly the same reason. Party composition makes
I love it.
Absolutely no difference, because of all the reasons why 5e is great. Because you don't have a rogue, that's not a problem, because as a background, you can get a proficiency with thieves' tools, so you have all the lockpicking skills you need. This isn't AD&D anymore, where only clerics and maybe druids can cast healing spells. Pretty much half the spellcasting panoply of D&D can cast healing spells. My favorite thing to do, and having written for organized play, for Adventures League play over the years, you're designing adventures and you have no idea what the composition of the party is going to be. You are counting on DMs, as James said, to use those in-game design skills to move things in a way that makes it possible. But you really just have to let the rules do what the rules do, which is say, there's a door in front of you. There isn't just one way to deal with that door. You don't just have to pick the lock. You can get around it with brute strength. You can get around it with magic. My favorite campaigns I've run for 5th edition are all with skewed parties, if you will. All barbarian half-orcs. You know what the best counterspell is? Hitting a mage in the face with a sword 72 times. A party of all monks. Absolutely fun. So much fun. Because if you do have a completely balanced party, what I've found is it turns into the same thing over and over and over again, especially at mid levels. It's like you go into the room. All right, well, the wizard is getting his counter spell ready if there's a wizard caster. We've got the banishment spell ready over here. We've got the rogue or the ranger who is looking for the place to hide. And it's the same thing. It's always the same thing. And it gets repetitive. It gets a little bit boring. Whereas if you present a party of all monks with very little magical abilities, one of these situations, they have to come at it from a completely different way. You get really interesting stories, really fun game mechanical situations that present themselves as opposed to the same old thing.
I think, here we go. So we've had, yes, it matters. No, it doesn't matter. I am of the belief that it shouldn't matter.
Bench sitter.
We've got the meme of the brain getting slightly bigger each time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, galaxy brain over here. Yeah, I don't know, because I do think it's like part of the draw of this game is you could play whatever you want. It's this modular like masterpiece, right? You've got 5 players. They each pick a class, but there are 12/13 classes. So you don't know what that party composition is going to look like. And half of the fun of it is the puzzle solving of how do we get around each of these issues. And I also think it's worth noting that again, the problem presented is not having a dedicated healer, as an example. But like Shawn said, you don't have a dedicated trap finder, you don't have a dedicated tank, whatever. But I think you will find that players can quite often naturally sift themselves into those zones, no matter the class, right? Maybe if you had a whole party of barbarians, you would find that you don't have a healer. But I mean, things like the healer feat do help with that. You probably don't need one because you're all taking half damage from everything. But I think it's the fact that classes ultimately, I don't think, affect that much. I think it's more about play style, which can be connected to class. But you look at things like Campaign 1 of Critical Role, Ashley Johnson was frequently out, and she was their party healer because she was the cleric. But frequently Sam, as the bard, would end up healing people because he was already a support player. He wasn't interested in dealing the most damage. He was interested in helping the other characters out, and part of that became healing them because their cleric wasn't around. And that's a very straightforward example, but I think trust the players to figure it out. Don't muck around with it too much. Don't worry about like, oh well, now I need to make sure that they all get potions all the time and they're super cheap. Your players have made their choice, and that's a challenge that came with their choice. Yeah, I think they'll figure it out. They're smart. They're smart people. They'll figure it out for themselves. Your ranger will probably end up being a decent healer if they go down the very sort of practical Aragorn-y route. Your bard might end up picking stuff up as well. I don't think it is something to fret over.
Yeah, I agree. I think the big thing that's missing from a party with no cleric isn't necessarily the complete lack of healing, but the lack of things like the life cleric. I'm not going to remember the name of the ability off the top of my head. I think it's Preserve Life, where they basically give a massive burst of healing to the entire party. And of course, Turn Undead, which is an extremely powerful ability when you're going up against hordes of undead. Those, I think, are the abilities that are going to lack more. I think
this is telling about your campaigns then.
I mentioned a couple of weeks ago.
About Ben's campaigns than anything.
I got blindsided by Speak with Dead. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and in that same kind of period, I constantly got blindsided by Turn Undead. It was just like every room, the undead were wandering around the edges of it, trying to find a way out. I'm like, damn it, again. But yeah, I don't think party composition. Yeah. I don't think party composition matters that much. And in fact, I encourage players not to worry about party composition. One of the most enjoyable one-shots I ran was a beginner session where it was only 3 players and they all played rogues. And so it became this kind of like Reservoir Dogs, Ocean's 11, heist style session.
How can we sneak around the problem?
Well, also, like, they didn't really trust each other either. Like, it was this real sort of, like, work together, but also standoff sort of atmosphere to the campaign. There's the typical, you hear about it a lot online. It's almost a meme of the, like, all bard party going on a pub crawl concert tour, which I've always wanted to run with Twisted Taverns. I think would be a lot of fun. So, yeah, I'd tell parties or players really don't worry about party composition at all, because I agree, Dael. I think they'll figure out a way to solve something. And if they can't, that's fine. There might be another solution. And what I mean by that is, like, you know, recently in a game that I ran, the party came across a locked gate that they don't have a rogue in the party and they can see on the other side of the gate. So they were like, well, we can't get through this gate. We don't want to bash it down because that would be noisy. What do we do? Oh, there's another tunnel over there that we can see enters that room as well. Let's just see if we can find a way around. And I was so pleased because there is a way around. And I was like, what a clever indirect way to solve the puzzle rather than just trying to brute force your way through it or keep throwing yourself at it until a solution presents itself. It's like, no, let's just re-engage somewhere else. Try to get a lateral solution to this.
And that's what a DM can do, is to be open to these kinds of non-solution solutions, right? You give a problem to your party of, so here's an example, the Dusk campaign from MCDM, the 4E campaign that I was in, we incidentally ended up with a party that is like, it's like 4 marshals and me. It's like a barbarian, a fighter, a warlord, a monk, and me, a small... fragile invoker. So, you know, we don't really have a healer. Our healer is our warlord. And I'm the only person who has any range, and none of us, we're all garbage at stealth. I think the monk has good stealth, and then bad things happened. So spoilers ahoy, pretty big ones. There's this moment where we tried to brute force our way through the problem because we're a bunch of fights. And it didn't work. We got stomped on. It was very bad. Someone died. I ended up in the Shadowfell. Very dramatic. But, you know, we got to the point where we were like, we literally can't force our way through here. And we don't have the ability to sneak through here. So what are we going to do? And here's the really big spoiler. We ended up deciding to deliberately, one of the big threats was that these enemies could hit us with arrows that would send us to the Shadowfell. And so we ended up deciding, let's deliberately send ourselves to the Shadowfell and travel through there and come up on the other side of this thing that we can't get through. You know what I mean? So the reason I'm telling you this is that, you know, sometimes you'll put a problem in front of your party. They don't have the tools to solve that problem, but it's okay because they'll figure out a different problem to solve, and you as the DM just have to be open to going, yeah, you know what? That sounds cool. Let's do that instead. Yeah.
I think with puzzles and obstacles that seem insurmountable, it doesn't matter if the party can't solve that puzzle as long as it doesn't bring the campaign or the story to a halt. As long as the momentum remains going forward, then you know, it's totally fine if that specific problem can't be solved.
Yeah, trust the instinct for a good story that is going to come from your players and from yourself.
That's a really good one-liner. Like, I would get that cross-stitched and hang it above my desk.
Got to put it on a Letterman jacket.
Yeah.
Speaking of great stories, we have another email which came in from Liam. Liam asking 2 questions, the first of which is around social encounters with 5e. I think we did touch on this in an earlier episode, and Liam mentioned this, so we may or may not end up retreading a little bit of ground, but I suppose just as a blanket question, how do we deal with social encounters using the scaffolding of 5e, which is typically fairly straightforward, right? It's like, convince NPC of X, NPC is not convinced, so make a intimidation, deception, or persuasion check, or an insight check, or performance if it happens to be relevant. The one thing that Liam does make a quick reference to, I'm just quickly skimming through the email, is the maneuvering system from Chronicles of Darkness, which uses a flowchart system, which is to determine goal, figure out doors that require opening, which I sort of, I assume, where translating it to 5e, where a check might sort of come into place. First impressions: how often can the party influence an NPC? A vice that the NPC has that can be used by the party or leveraged. Soft leverages such as bribes or gifts, or forcing doors such as intimidation or assaulting the NPC. Using all of these things to increase or decrease the resistance towards the goal getting achieved, which seems a much more systemic, flowcharty way of addressing social encounters. And maybe the answer we will find here is they're all dungeons. The social encounter is just like a bunch of rooms that you can go into. But Shawn, what do you think? How do you generally approach social encounters to make them more engaging than just a single yes or no ability check?
Well, we have to recognize, first of all, that 5e is not the perfect system for this. 5e emphasizes the pass-fail resolution system. You either succeed or you fail, yes or no. So what you do have to do is create this sort of scaffolding. And guess what 4e did? They had skill challenges, and that's exactly what we're talking about here.
I was going to say, you took words out of my mouth. Go on.
Sorry, Dael. And
no, I'm happy.
What happened with that is people saw D&D as a pass-fail system, and they said, "This doesn't work. This isn't helpful. And all that skill challenges are a system by which you can build your scaffold. That's what skill challenges in 4E was trying to show. Unfortunately, as a user manual, it failed horribly because they used poor examples. They tried to horn it in a way that didn't quite work the way that even they intended it to work. So later publications for 4th edition did go on to say, this is really what we meant, and here are some things you can do. But by then it was too late. The rage-filled horse was far, far out of the barn. But that's what you have to do. If you want to do a social encounter, you need to make that flowchart. You need to set up a system of these are the things that the characters may be able to leverage, and they need to do these things in order to get at least a passing success, if not a full success. And then you, as the designer of the adventure, whether you're the DM or the adventure writer, need to lay that out with always with the understanding that it needs to fit with the story. And that's the second thing. I'm going to let somebody else talk about this, but D&D isn't necessarily made for social checks because we have something called role-playing. Mm-hmm. And where D&D often fails now, too, is we have role-playing. So you give this grand speech. What does the DM say? Make a perception or persuasion check. And then what happens? No matter what the grand speech was, you're going to roll either high, where the half-orc barbarian grunts and rolls a natural 20 and is much more eloquent by the rules than the bard with all the feats and all the powers that allow them to add plus 19 to their check, but they end up rolling a 1. So there's so much in game design baggage that 5e and D&D in general brings, that this is something that we could talk about for several episodes. But I will step back and let others share their thoughts.
Shawn, I really like what you talked about flowcharts, about designing a conversation via means of flowcharts. In human psychology, there are two terms that I think apply really strongly to the role-playing aspect of role-playing games, and it's the concept of algorithms and heuristics. To give a very short and pared-down definition, an algorithm is a stepwise process that produces a result through specific mechanisms, a flowchart, if you will, of inputs and outputs. Very sort of computerized, whereas a heuristic is a much more humanistic, free-flowing interpretation of inputs leading to outputs. A child learning to speak is a heuristic process because it's all very organic. You will not teach a child to speak when they are an infant by drilling them on English vocabulary. That's not going to be how it works. And that is often the thing that, whether they know it or not, a DM is grappling with when they're faced with a role-playing encounter like this. Algorithms take a lot of work to set up in the moment, and it's very specific work because you have to plan out a lot of stuff. And even once you've planned out all of your flowcharts and outputs and assumed outcomes, the players could still do something you didn't expect, and then all of a sudden you're in heuristic territory. Whereas if you've kind of trained your DMing instinct, if you're a DM of 20 years and you have done this, this isn't your first rodeo, you'll kind of have a sense of how conversations like this play out, about what you can do to react to players when they do the sort of things that players usually do. And suddenly you've got a good heuristic process set up. So ultimately, it comes down to a level of, are you going to prepare specifically for this exact social encounter? Or are you going to prepare very broadly for social encounters in general? And I think that, honestly, the best thing for a DM who doesn't have decades of experience is to do a little bit of both. You'll want to train your broad sense so that you can react on the fly and be a good improvisational role player. But honestly, well-planned out social encounters feel really fun. Just like well-planned out combat encounters can feel really fun also. As long as you aren't restricting your players' options, as long as you're ready to heuristically adapt to what they're doing on the fly and not railroading them, the eternal boogeyman, then having an encounter where cool things happen, where the players do something and you've planned a cool thing to happen, a cool reaction, that's fun.
I tend to err on the side myself of doing social encounters with less scaffolding, but not less complexity, because I was a performing artist, and part of the fun for me as a role player is getting into the character and really getting into the voice of the character and really role playing the characters out with the player characters, with the party, which has a weakness in the way that I run social encounters, which is I often don't think I ask for ability checks often enough. I just decide role-playing whether the NPC is convinced or not convinced, which can be a little bit unfair to players who want to play that charismatic character, but they're not personally quick on their toes, or they're not, performing artists themselves. But I think a very simple bit of advice to just instantly elevate social encounters, in my opinion, is don't let insight just be a lie detector or a deception detector. Once players start to figure out that they can use insight to gauge the mood of the character or gauge the, as we approach this guard and we want to get through this gate, can I insight check them to gauge whether they might be open to bribery, or whether they might react poorly if we try to intimidate them, or whether they might react well to intimidation? Is this a green, guard who only just signed up and he's looking really uncertain about who he is and isn't allowed to let through and might react well to intimidation? Or does this dude look like a hardened veteran with a scar down the side of his face and he is not going to react well if somebody walks up to him with their weapons drawn? And using insight can help, I suppose, sort of talking it out and thinking about it. It can help the players set their goals or set their approach for the social encounter. So if the goal is to get through the gate that the guard is guarding, and they walk up and somebody who is good at insight rolls a quick insight check to kind of gauge the mood of the guard, or whether or not, their basic personality, what they can tell from just looking at them, or after a few, words of conversation, what they can tell about this person, it helps the players then make game-like or gamified choices about whether they want to use intimidation or persuasion, or they want to use performance to try to distract the guard. Do they look bored? And I find that insight is that skill that just constantly becomes a lie detector. Are they lying to me? Are they being deceitful? Are they keeping something back from me? It's like, no, it can do so much more than that, than just, detect deceit. Dael, how do you tend to run your social encounters?
I think that this conversation has just highlighted two very different approaches to this that it just highlights the eternal problem of social and mental play in D&D, right? Because we've got on one side we've got the scaffolding approach, which if you follow the skill challenge thing, what that's trying to do basically is Rob Donahue, who's a game designer from Evil Hat, has a really great thread on Twitter somewhere where he's talking about the fact that D&D is ultimately, as a pass-fail system, it's relying on a lot of rolls to trend positively, right? The fact that combat works because you're making a lot of rolls. I'm sure I touched on this last time. You're making a lot of rolls, and even though you miss sometimes on an individual roll, you're rolling so many times in combat that on the whole, you're going to have a positive outcome. And we don't tend to do that with social encounters or mental encounters. And so the skill challenge kind of approach is trying to give you that. Which is, it's a very structured, rule-focused way of doing it. It's very mechanically focused. The Benjamin Byrne school, on the other hand, is another piece of good advice. These are both pieces of good advice. That's the trouble with this, is throw away the rules. Let yourself be swayed. This person, your player has just given you a speech, and you know that it was convincing. You know that it was good. So why would you have them roll for that? You yourself have been swayed. Just let the character be swayed, or if you know that the character would not care about the thing that they've said, don't do that, and that does deliberately kind of forget the rules for a minute, which has its own, pros and cons to it. Both of these are flawed systems, but are, interesting and useful pieces of advice.
What you can do is, these don't have to be opposite poles. Scaffolding, when used as a skill challenge where you're just rolling, yes, that's very rules focused. Scaffolding doesn't have to be that, though. Scaffolding can just be planning. So scaffolding is the first thing that the characters must realize is the person they're trying to convince is worried. So, and they want to be reassured. So it doesn't have to be a roll. It can just be you realize that they're worried and they're glancing in the shadows. So if they say anything while role-playing that reassures the person that they're safe, then they've passed the first check, no roll needed. So scaffolding can still be role-playing. And if you can combine all of those in a way that engages what your players like to do, you can even start to get the role players to think about the game mechanically by adding a check every once in a while, or get your ROLE players to think about it game in terms of role playing by making them say the secret phrase that will get them to the next step in the scaffold.
And you know where we can find this scaffolding as it already exists in 5e? Personality traits, buns, ideals, and flaws. Yeah. I actually at some point designed a bard subclass that I deliberately made a whole subclass feature that drew on that. It was like, you can do this thing and it will tell you this NPC's bond or ideal or flaw. Like you can pick one of those things and it will tell you what it is. And I remember having this wrestling match with the editor at the time because they were saying, this doesn't make sense. No player is going to understand how to use this. It's not mechanical. But the thing is that it is this place where that meets, right? It is something that is on every character sheet that everyone is meant to have. And you should be able to use those things. Insight should be giving you those pieces of information. Their family is the most important thing to them. They think that money is the most important thing. They have greed. Maybe it's a flaw instead of an ideal. You know what I mean?
Mm.
This highlights exactly what I was saying earlier about the game master having a game design role baked into what they do. Because there are a lot of D&D games that just don't work that way. And it's not because the game doesn't work that way. It's because that's not how the game master is running their game. And there are a lot of games that do work that way because that's a part of the game system that the game master is focused on. You can see in a lot of modern video games that have dialogue trees. Like, I'm playing The Witcher 3, so I'll be the one to bring up The Witcher again.
Witcher watch.
There's a lot of scenes in that game, especially I think in its very sort of socially focused Blood and Wine scenarios, where you will say an option, and all of a sudden you're not just in that sort of over the shoulder 1-shot, 2-shot conversation camera. the camera will very cinematically pan away and the character will walk around their meticulously designed house environment, or they'll point to like a thing on their table that will reinforce something about the character. And that stuff only exists because someone who is designing the game thought about it. Otherwise, you could you could be with a more or less two-dimensional NPC in a shot, reverse shot sort of conversation format where only the task at hand is relevant. But the good thing about being a game master is you don't have to plan all that stuff from the beginning. As soon as a character starts to get invested in that, you can think on your feet and say that like, yeah, you want to know what's most important to this person. Family's most important to this person. And you can tell that because they have a lavishly painted watercolor that isn't very good, but you can tell that their kid painted it of their family. It's like, you just have to be able to think on your feet and develop that skill.
Do you know what can be fun about that, though, is like creating, mystery or red herrings, or like a way where the social encounter needs to be solved, because the idea you've just given me with that watercolor painting is it's like, this individual, this lord, seems to very much care for his family because there's this big watercolor painting of his, family up on the wall inside of his throne room. And so that seems to be, really at the center of what is on his mind. And so he will act to protect his loved ones. But then an insight check reveals it's not his family, it's not his love for his loved ones, it's his love for his legacy and the idea of family, because you notice in the painting that the most prominent thing is everybody is wearing the family crest, and his sons are in the room, but they're standing very dutifully off to the side, they're not, there's no air of love in the room around them. So sort of creating, like, describing the appearance of a room and the appearance of the characters and the apparent mood of the characters, but then hiding, quote unquote, hidden doors, or creating a social puzzle in there that can be unraveled by using insight checks predominantly, but possibly also, becomes revealed as the conversation continues, can make social encounters feel more dynamic if they're not as immediately presented. And it's not even about deception either. It's not that the Lord is trying to deceive everybody that he's a family man. It's just that, it all is not as it initially appears. The problem I find with over-scaffolding social encounters, and just quickly jumping back to The Witcher in the tabletop role-playing game, it has social encounters as social combat. And I believe, just reading it recently, the Infinity RPG, which is by Modifius, also has, I think they call it psychological warfare or something like that. And the idea is that you have psychological hit points that, when it is reduced to 0, the social encounter is unlocked. This is a very poor understanding of how these systems work, because I haven't read them in a while. But my problem with such strongly scaffolded social encounters is that I often find myself, as someone who deeply wants to roleplay, caught in a jarring situation where the dice or the rules say, yes, this NPC is convinced, but I feel role-playing the NPC that the argument was not very convincing, or they wouldn't react in the way that the rules are saying that they need to react for XYZ role-play reason. The flip side of that is, I've also found, using those rules, sometimes it presents a very fun improvisation style game, like theater sports style game, where it's like, well, I have to react in this way, so I'm just going to make it work in my head, and I'm going to navigate as this NPC through this, through the parameters that have been thrown down for me. Yeah, exactly.
This brings up an interesting point that's come up in one of my home games lately, the one I'm a player in. And it's, I love the system you proposed, Ben, where it's all very sort of intuitive and you feel it out and you look for clues and kind of approach each social encounter like you're a detective. But honestly, sometimes I just kind of want to roll an insight check and figure out if they're lying.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying that that's not what it's used for. I'm not saying that it can't be used for that, or it shouldn't be used for that, or you're doing insight wrong if you use it that way. That is absolutely what insight is for. I guess I'm just saying it's not the only thing that insight should be used for.
Yeah.
And we can take this even to a larger scale and say we're talking about social interaction, scenes, anything that's not hitting a monster and taking its hit points has the same sort of problem with in D&D and in 5e. We could talk about chase scenes. We could talk about cooking scenes. We can talk about anything where it's not just one die roll gets you a success or fail. All of that is problematic when you try to codify it in some way with rules that aren't just, a gate that opens or stays closed.
I think the other thing is that social encounters are inherently more complex than combat encounters in terms of the results that you can get from them, because they don't necessarily have a success or fail outcome, like typically, combats can be more important or more dynamic, more complex than did you kill the monster or didn't you, right? But typically they tend to be you succeeded, you killed the monster, or no, the monster didn't escape, or you captured the NPC if you're fighting to capture somebody instead. But typically it's did you win the combat or didn't you? And there are variables in terms of people running away or doing this, that, or the other. But there's also, in a social encounter, it's more dynamic. It can be more dynamic than a simple success or failure. I think of Yoda's "there is no try." It's like, no, you didn't get through the gate. This guard cannot let you through. But what did you succeed in doing instead? Now you know his name. You have a personal connection on the guard force that might be able to be used later. Or the guard tells you that there's another way that you might be able to get through the gate. Or you insight something out of the guard that they weren't trying to give away, but they did by accident, And so it means that you didn't succeed in this specific circumstance, but the social dynamic of the situation has changed, which provides you with an alternative solution. Or, I've run the big masquerade ball in an urban campaign. It was sort of, within it was like the end of the first act of the campaign, if you will. No, technically. There were monsters involved, but the party didn't know at the time because they were all, illusioned and whatnot. But it was this...
They're wearing masks.
Yeah, exactly. It was this lord who had invited, all these important NPCs, and it was a big introduction of all the players, the NPC players on the board that the party were going to interact with. And it... it was very Game of Thrones. There was a lot of NPCs to introduce, and it's sort of like, here's their names and their titles. Now go and interact with who you want to interact with. But there's also a social stratosphere here, right? You can't get up to the top level of this masquerade ball because you don't have the social clout to yet. But if you introduce yourself to somebody on the lower level, they might take you up to meet their contact who's on the upper level, blah, 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 blah. And the point of this masquerade ball isn't to succeed or fail or come away with a victory, but gauge the social landscape of the campaign and make friendships and potentially make enemies. And I've run it a handful of times, and each time the party comes out with a slightly different resolution, and it's not about success or fail. And one party didn't do better at it than the other, but they just had different relationships. NPCs had different opinions of the party at the end of the masquerade ball, which charted a different course through the campaign because they had different relationships with the NPCs. So social encounters aren't just about victory or defeat. They can be about more dynamic things than that, which I think is also what makes them complicated. And I have just realized that we are massively over time. I thought we were like 15 minutes ago in my head, and then I just looked at the time and we are not 15 minutes ago. So that is the end of this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. If you have an email like Gethin or Liam that you want to ask us, please send it through to podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. I do read through all of them and then pick out as many as I can to bring to the podcast. Or you can leave a comment in the YouTube comments below if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes or Apple Podcasts, I think it's technically called, please leave us a rating. It helps the podcast grow and spread the word of the Eldritch Lorecast. My name is Ben Byrne, and I've been in... I'm going to do that again, Dante. My name is Ben Byrne, and I've been here, as always, with James Hake, Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill, and until next week, we will see you then.